Welcome back to the Fly Culture Podcast, your weekly look inside the world of fly fishing presented by Pete Tigers. If you're enjoying listening, please consider subscribing.
Steve Lum is an experienced and well-travelled angler. He is equally at home with a single or double-handed rod, either casting a dry fly at a rising trout or swinging an intruder for steelhead. He has always searched out fishing off of the grid and tackle that is a little different too. I hear about his fishing career and what is sitting in his rod quiver right now. Steve Lum, a very warm welcome to the Fly Culture Podcast. How do I find you today?
Well, you found me quite relaxed. I'm just gotten off my day at work, as many people, in the last 2 years they've been working from home, and during the COVID. So yes, I've just come off my day at work, and looking forward to having our chat about fishing, basically. So yeah.
Me too, and I know we were talking off mic a little bit, and we were talking about we met briefly when you came down to Devon to fish with a mutual friend, and we were trying to figure out how many years ago, and it's getting really difficult to figure stuff out because you sort of kind of take the 2 COVID years out, don't you? Or we try our best to forget them and then sort of add them back in again. But it was a few years now, wasn't it?
I think it must have been at least 5 or 6 years, but as you say, add 2 onto that is probably a good estimate. So it's probably 7 years or something like that. Yeah.
Absolutely, and I'm really looking forward to catching up with you I'm sure our listeners will love listening as a tackle connoisseur as well. I thought we could just talk about fishing, of course, but also tackle and the route your tackle selection has gone over the period of your fishing. And I was also thinking, actually, that the online magazine Eat Sleep Fish that I used to run, that you appeared in that as well, didn't you? And wrote a lovely story about catching steelhead.
Oh, yes. I remember that now. I wrote that article for you when I went on my 50th anniversary, not anniversary, my 50th birthday, a huge milestone. And I went over to the Frontier Far West Lodge in BC, and that was a fantastic trip, and I think that became actually the start of my sort of love for double-handed bamboo. So that was a great trip. It sort of became like a point where I sort of started to leave the graphite behind and started to pick up bamboo, because because the only guy that I've really concentrated on is this James Reed from Vancouver, and he made my first bamboo spey rod, and he's continued to make them over the last 10 years, both double-handed and single-handed, and I guess I'm his number one fan, and so it just sort of cemented my love really for bamboo.
Nice. And we'll come on to the rods very, very shortly.
Okay.
Where was it that you actually fished when you were over in BC? And for our listeners, there'll be some, we've had guests on previously. We've had John on, who is a steelhead guide himself. But how would you describe steelhead to somebody that's not fished for them, and how would you make a comparison between either sea trout and salmon? Is there any sort of comparisons that you can make with them as a fish, particularly when you've hooked one?
I guess it all depends really on the they have their summer steelhead and then the winter steelhead, and I guess it depends on which one you're really fishing for, because in general the summer fish are more aggressive and they'll probably take flies, but anyone who's fished for the winter guys will know that there are few and far between, and you probably spend a lot of time making a lot of casts in very horrible weather, and if you come away with one hookup, you're doing well. So in general, yes, they're incredibly aggressive fish, and I guess if you had some big sea trout or salmon on, there would be I guess pound for pound similar, but in terms of the actual grab, I think is it's a lot more exciting, and especially when you have something which is sort of ripping line off your classic reel. It just makes a hell of a lot of a difference. So yeah.
And where were you on that special trip? Where were you fishing? Which river were you fishing? And have you
Uh,
subsequently done more steelheading?
Um, well, the actually the first steel netting I actually did was way back in the 90s, and I went to Alaska and fished on Kodiak, but it was a different type of fishing. It was all single handers, and I guess back then in the 90s, double handed didn't really take off, and it was all sort of tossing leaded rigs on either sort of egg flies or nymphs, and then pushing them through like little pockets, and the takes were very very subtle. So they would you'd pick it up and you'd feel something like some there was a weed or something like that on the end of your line, and then lifting into it, it would then go crazy, and then you'd be, fighting this fish. But in terms of with the double-handed rods and spay fishing for them, they're actually hitting it on the swing. Obviously there are times when they're in this slack water, and you would have a similar sort of thing where they would just sort of like take it in very very soft water, but in general they would hit it on the swing, and they're a lot more aggressive, I think, than than an Atlantic salmon, where it would just pluck it and then draw it out and then you lift into it. But definitely it's I guess a more exciting take. As they say, the tug is a drug. In terms of steelheading. Yeah.
Nice. And which river were you on for your 50th?
Oh, it was actually at the Bulkley, and it was that trip. It was the Bulkley, and also it was split into two. So then we went on to a smaller trip called the Maurice, and that was I was much more personal. I think it's sort of a lot smaller, and you could actually you could actually see the fish as they were taking it. There was some wonderful moments when I was with one of the guides, and he was actually spotting the fish and watching it, and I could actually feel, as the fly swung through, you could just feel it mouth the fly, but then it would let go. And he said, "Oh, no, no, try it again." So I'd put it out, and it would come up, mouth it again, and we tried many different flies. But he was up on a high position, and just watching it as this big buck came up and just mouthed the fly and just let it go again. And it was just, and I didn't actually hook him that time, but it was an amazing experience to in that little tiny river like that, tiny trip, and it's also very it's famous for a steelhead on the dry, which I didn't actually hook any, but I definitely threw a couple of bombers and skated them for them, but didn't any actually hook up on it. Yeah.
Nice. And I've been lucky enough to fish the Bulkley, which is
Oh,
fabulous.
right.
And
Okay.
you've got as you mentioned, the Maurice, and you've got the Babine as well, haven't you? Which I'm
Yeah.
told is Bear Central, isn't it? That's a pretty good place to go find a bear if you're still heading out there. But I know when we fished the Bulkley that I was with a group of 4 friends and we just did it ourselves. And we did take a day actually of guiding just
Oh my
to
God.
cover some water. But where we were
Yeah.
staying, there was a pool that was hot. And I think we caught something like 6 or 7 steelhead from this pool. And we were not a million miles away from Smithers. And word was getting out, and the other bank was getting busier and busier and busier with local anglers as well, which was kind of cool. And we'd see the boats going up the river, but it was amazing fun. That's the first time, and I was telling somebody about it the other day actually, where I've got into a river in, I think it was October, end of October, I can't remember now, and it was so cold. That water was seriously cold. I remember we were up at silly o'clock, completely jet lagged, Duncan and I, and we could just feel the cold on our legs. And, at one stage I said, look, I've just got to get out. He caught one actually. And then I said, I have to get out for a bit. So, but happy memories of there, and an amazing place. So I kind of know in my mind exactly where you are, and an amazing fish as well. But eagle-eared listeners will probably gather that you are not originally from the UK. And can you tell us a bit where your background of fishing, and then what brought you to fishing in the UK?
To be honest, it's quite a what would I call it? A potted past. I mean, I was actually born in the Caribbean. So when I was very young, my family emigrated to Australia. My mother has family in Australia, so we took that opportunity to move from the Caribbean, and I grew up there, and started sort of fishing in Queensland, which is on the east side in the north. So no, definitely no trout and steelhead there, but it was all sort of um, saltwater fish on bait and lures, and I was obsessed by fishing. I don't know what really drove this because no one in my family actually fished, but you know, I continued to fish throughout my teens, and then in my early 20s, I came over to England on a working holiday. It was supposed to be for 2 years, and I never went back. So I've been here for more than 30 years, I think now. When I first arrived, I continued on in that vein, fishing for, you know, coarse type fish with lures. I fished with bait casters and spinning reels. Um, they were all sort of top end reels, reels and rods, and all Loomis ABUs, Shimano type stuff. But I've always had this fascination of trout. You know, I never fished for them in Australia. But as a young boy, I always had this fascination of trout, which was all down in the southern states, and um, and I guess that pushed me to starting to move into fly fishing. And Pete Cockwell, who supplied me with all of my who was the then Able and Loomis distributor in the UK. He started supplying me with Loomis GLX rod, and so I started as most people who fish started fly fishing in the UK. I started going to still waters, gradually moving into rivers because that was more interesting, sort of like moving on to places like the Test and things like that. But then sort of moving more further afield, and then gradually into destination fishing. So definitely, it moved very, very quickly. So it wasn't that I, started fishing, in the 90s. I had a lot of other fishing beforehand, but then because I had that, I moved very quickly up into the fly scene, and then basically left the other stuff behind. So yeah.
Nice. And it's interesting you mentioned about that you're not from a family of fishermen, and I'm the same as well. And I
Yeah.
always try and think about what caused that. I know what took me on that route of fly fishing, but it wasn't sort of a traditional route in that sense that I just sort of forged up ahead, having done course fishing as a kid, obviously, and then into fly fishing. But I sort of found my own way. And then, like you say, forsaking everything else for the fly rod. I don't know why. It must be, and I've said before, I don't know if it's something to do with the casting that I like, having played a bit of sport. I don't know, or there's something pleasing about it. It's a difficult way to catch a fish. And that's interesting. And it's still, all these years later, still to me, fascinates me, and I find it interesting. And I can always find something new or interesting that ignites a new passion within a passion that takes such a large part of my life. But interesting, you mentioned Pete Cockrell as well. He's been a guest on the podcast, but I also shout out, this is being recorded on the 12th of April, and I saw that he's got a book out. So have a look at that, because I'm sure that will be, for stillwater anglers particularly, I think it will be a fantastic read as well. So it looks beautifully packaged. I spoke to him 2 or 3 weeks ago, but I've not had a chance to speak to him since this book's live. So I wish him the very best of luck with that, and go search that out. But like you say, I was exactly the same. That I have a GLX from him, I have an Able reel from him, I have another Loomis rod from him, and again, he's a fabulous salesman because doesn't oversell it. And there's still those rods. You mentioned obviously you had an affinity with Loomis via your previous sort of fishing. Was that a natural thing to go into Loomis fly rods as a result of that?
Yes, I think definitely. When we started moving into graphite, um, and especially sort of like top end graphite, there was not a lot around. I mean, the early days there were sort of like Fenwicks and stuff like that, but then Loomis started to take in the top shelf for graphite, for spinning anyway, so spinning and casting. And in fact, my first experience with the Loomis is I actually went back to Australia in the mid '90s, and I ended up and I was back down there for about nine months or something, and I picked up some Loomis IMX rods, spinning and bait casting rods, but they were actually licensed to be made in Australia. I picked them up and then brought them back to England, and then found the distributor, which is Pete Cockwell, and he supplied me with probably another dozen IMX rods. I think I do this with most of my gear. I just go a bit bananas, and I go very tunnel visioned with this, and so I end up going down this IMX, Loomis IMX, and then GLX, I guess, enable reel. So I just went down that for quite a long way before I started to veer off into others like Winston, sort of like and although and I don't know really what drove that, except in the fact that the feel, I guess the feel and the look of the things changed my direction, because although Loomis, they're incredible performance rods, they didn't really sort of look very special, and I guess that made a big difference for me, and I guess possibly going further down into the bamboo path, look and feel have quite a lot to do with my tackle choices, I think. So yeah.
And tell me about Winston, because I've never owned a Winston rod. I think I was initially put off because they were so deeper loading. I may have cast one or two of them over the years. I know they brought a stiffer rod out that I gave some tuition to a lady who had one, which it was a really interesting rod to cast. But and funnily enough, my daughter's been staying, and we were talking about the Jefferson River, which is right by where Winston are based. So I went to Two Bridges. I saw a sign on the road and said, "I've got to see the Winston," which is not, as I've always said, these things aren't as impressive as perhaps you may think. I think sometimes people feel these are multi-million pound or dollar businesses, but it was, humble's the wrong word, but it wasn't what I was expecting, but it was kind of cool to be able to see it and then fish the river just a bit further down the line there. But how would you describe Winston rods to somebody like myself that doesn't know them so well? And why do they have that cult following? And why do you think is it that those amongst other brands as well, like Thomas and Thomas that appear every now and again and then don't, why do you think that those are not as active in the UK market as other brands like Sage, for example?
Well, Winston was, I guess, interesting in that it has such a long history, but it has gone through several different ownerships, and the current owner has tried to keep that link with the past, although it is sort of like gradually moving into a direction which is more alongside the other sort of performance brands. But for me, anyway, the reason I liked it was for exactly what I said. They were absolutely beautiful rods. All handmade in Twin Bridges. They were beautiful, and they were performant, but still felt very good. Like I know, when I first started to buy these rods, you know, the super stiff rods were all the rage, and it was amazing that Winston were trying to put rods out, which which achieved virtually the same sort of performance, but with rods which flexed lower and felt really good to cast and fight fish on. So they were I think that was the sort of like three-pronged sort of approach that they had, of looking good, having performance, and then feeling really good to fish with as well. Um, and I know it didn't have, and it still doesn't have a very big following in the UK, and I think it's because of just the fact that a lot of people don't really like that feel of rods flexing down into the middle of the rod. I'm always amazed, how people always say it's too bloody soft, and it's but it's not soft. They're just not used to feeling a semi-parabolic or a parabolic rod, and you can still have really fast recovery, but they're just not used to rods which flex down into the middle of the rod. So yeah. um and for me, that flexing is what makes it feel really good. Obviously you don't want a noodle which you can't cast in wind or anything like that, but that the way it sort of flexes and recovers, that is what makes it feel really good. And I think it's one of its biggest attractions, I think. So yeah.
Interesting you talk about the deeper loading blank there as well, because I was just thinking then about the Sage Circa, and I don't know if you cast one of those. And I had one of those, and I had an 8'9" 3-weight, which was a very deep loading rod, and it didn't last very long because I guess part of it would probably be their natural customer would want those, as you say, medium to stiffer rods. But do you think that was a test to see if there was appetite? The reason I say that for deeper loading rods is that ever since we've had those super stiff rods, and I think of the TCR and on a little bit further from that, even Sage rods are not as stiff as they were. Do you think that may have been sort of a process? See, let's see what the marketplace is like for a deeper loading rod, or was it also that timed with the reawakening of the glass market as well, and they were trying to tap into that? Do you think?
I think the glass market came later, and I think it started really by the fact that although these stiff rods could cast incredible distances and things like that, um, fishing is not all about casting. It's about and I guess there's a lot of the things like fighting the fish, and whether a super stiff rod is going to break off fish and things like that. you know um I guess the more medium and progressive medium rods are just better fishing tools. You may not be able to cast as far, but a lot of time you don't need to cast 120 foot to catch fish. So in terms of like a better all-around tool, then I guess they had to start moving into more fishable rods, and that sort of started changing the market really. And as you said with glass, it turned, it has now come to pass that these glass rods, which are very deep flexing, are incredible fish fighting tools, and even to the point where they're becoming very popular in blue water fishing because these things are incredibly strong, almost unbreakable, and whereas in some situations they would probably break a graphite rod, uh, um, you know, a glass rod in the salt will hold up. So that's that sort of thing. I think it's very niche. Obviously, you couldn't use a deep flexing rod for every situation, but I think where they do where they do suit, they're incredible tools. So yeah.
Yeah, and I was just thinking some more there actually about those deeper loading rods and Winston, obviously, and Scott with their range, the G series originally G2, and then has it gone to G again? I can't remember what it's called now. And they were always, and the G2 they made for a number of years. And I remember when I first fished in the States many, many, many years ago now, and a Western rod was thought of as a deeper loading rod. And I wonder if, obviously where Scott are based and where Winston are based, they were tackling their customers' needs with those deeper loading rods as well. So they've always kind of been there in the background. And then perhaps Sage with the more a little bit further across in Washington there and Steelhead and everything else, that perhaps a stiffer rod was required there. I don't know. It's just, this is, like I said to you, the conversation takes lots of different turns, and I'm trying to figure out in my mind where that's come from. Yeah, like we say, Winston have never really got the traction they probably deserve here. I remember you could get them at Foxton's, couldn't you, years back? But I don't know if you can even buy a Winston rod in the UK now, can you?
Not that I could. I mean, I've actually sort of lost track of it, but definitely there are some on the continent. There are dealers on the continent, and there have been many people who've tried to take on the dealership and failed miserably, and sort of like let it go after a few years because basically, as I said, UK fishermen in general don't like that action. They'd rather something like a Sage, which is stiffer, more backbone, for want of a better word. They just don't like the action. I mean, there are a few people around, and when you do find them, they absolutely love them, and they wouldn't give them up for anything. But yes, in general, I think it's just not. And I guess maybe I've touched on this with some people that fishing is a different thing for a lot of people here in the UK. I think it's all about catching a lot of fish, from what I gather, and a rod or a reel is really just a tool to enable them to get that. Whereas in a lot of places, it's more than that. There's the whole thing of history or pride of ownership and just things like that, which may influence a purchase or owning something in another sort of location. Whereas I think in general in the UK, from what I can see, there are very few people who would, think outside of that, and it's really, just a tool, to be honest. So anyway, that's what I think.
Yeah, and with Winston as well, I guess, the majority of our market, or the larger part of the market, is probably still water. So, whacking out a die 7 on a stiff rod makes a lot more sense. So I get that, and I can see that. We're sort of talking about, these would be regarded, and they are premium brand rods. And there may be people listening, so, well, they're talking about expensive rods, they're talking about. But part of me, why I wanted to talk about this as well, was that we're in a stage now where rod prices, and I understand the reasons that rod prices are doing what they're doing right now, material costs, shipping costs, everything that goes with that is pushing it higher and prices higher. But I kind of also think, well, we're talking about some of these brands, and, I was kind of mentioning some of these because people may be able to search out, like you say, the pride of ownership angle of it that they could go find on auction sites or whatever these brands at, second hand and a little bit cheaper, or on forums or whatever that may be, Facebook or wherever it may be, and you can get access to beautifully well-made serviceable rods at a little bit cheaper. Do you see this with that price? And I've touched on it a little bit in previous podcasts as well. Do you think with the prices of new rods and the environment that we're in at the moment, do you think that may push the second-hand market a little bit higher as a result, because of these price constraints we're looking at right now?
I think definitely something has to change because as you say, like a top brand, you're looking at over £1,000 for a top brand like a Winston or a Sage. I stopped buying graphites, top end graphites like Winston's probably 10 years ago, and it was, they were a little over 600, so it's just about doubled in price in 10 years, which is an amazing sort of jump. And I think a lot of that has been the last 2 years that we've experienced with COVID, and and also I guess moving out of the common market, whereas we have to pay whereas previously you could have bought from a dealer on the continent, and then you'd have probably not paid VAT, but all those sort of things combine now to push the prices up. And as you say, £1,000 is a lot of money in any man's term. Years ago that you'd be buying a custom made or a bamboo rod for that sort of money, but not a graphite rod. So yes, definitely something has to change. I think a lot of people are looking at, as you say, secondhand rods, doing them themselves, or getting a custom builder to build on a blank for them. I know I've done that myself in the last 2 years during lockdown. I got a glass rod, a glass blank from Tomo Ejuin, and had it built up by a builder, Sandy Nelson, up in Scotland, and it was a fantastic rod, and in all intents and purposes, it's a better rod than you would get if you bought it from a tackle store. So yes, and it would it would probably £100 cheaper as well. So definitely these sorts of things people have to look at, because £1,000 is a lot of money, even if you've got a few pounds in your pocket, sort of thing.
Yeah, absolutely. And it makes you, at that price level, you think, well, actually, and I've always done that. And I think that's why I sort of flirted with Thomas & Thomas rods and Loomis rods in the past, because I wanted something a little bit different. And I think, again, that's something that I've been doing. And I managed to, just post-Brexit, managed to get a Gatti rod from Italy, which I've mentioned on here before, which is sublime and a little bit different. It's a 9-foot 2/3 weight, and it suits the fishing I do fabulously well. It doesn't interfere with the lengths of my bamboo rods or the glass rod that I have. And I look now more not for the new model, but something that will fit into the fishing that I do. So I have a 9.5-foot 4-weight graphite rod that Luke Bannister built for me, that does a lot of the heavy lifting, and I can do just about anything with that rod. And it's really nice. And it may not be as super light as some of these rods, but I like the feel in my hands. Some of them now are getting so light. Like you said, I like to feel what the blank's doing a little bit more. And I with that's very, it's minimal amounts, but I can feel what it's doing, and I really enjoy that aspect of it. But hunting down these rods, and I get a lot of messages from people saying, "Oh, I found this," or "I found that," is kind of fun as well, isn't it? And certainly with, some of the older sage rods. A friend of mine contacted me today about it was a range of rods Sage built called the SPLCA that was called Center Axis, and it had a reel attached to it. Yeah, and I know Theo Pike, a good friend, has one of those, and somebody contacted me today actually and said they'd managed to find one, and that's a 25 plus year old rod now, but I put a different line on it and it just came to life. So I fished with these things again, and I think we're almost sort of not nostalgic, but it may be price constraints that do that allow us to look back at rods we may have owned and parted company with that we kind of miss a little bit now as well. And so we can look back, and with all these ways of actually buying secondhand tackle, we can do it. And for me, my humble opinion is that sometimes if you can find a 200 quid older, well-known brand, that can represent great value and still has some residual value when you decide you don't want it anymore. But my feel or my sense is that I do wonder if people will start looking at older rods again and actually just fishing those. So that momentum of changing a rod every 3-4 years, I wonder if that might change. I hope it doesn't from the rod manufacturer's point of view, but I wonder if people will look at rods in a different way. Do you sense that? Do you get a feel of that perhaps?
Yes, I mean, I think the whole world's changing, and this whole mentality of throwaway tackle, I think that's definitely changed. I remember one of the things that actually turned me off Loomis was the fact that, if you broke something on it, like you broke the tip on your GLX, instead of going and getting this repaired or getting a new part of it, they would actually for 75 quid give you a whole new Loomis GLX, which was and presumably that whole rod was just tossed in the bin, And I remember an article that David Norwich wrote, saying that they was creating these huge black forests of thrown away graphite rod parts. He called them a black forest, and whereas with some brands like Winston, people had them for decades, and instead of tossing the thing away, they would send them and they would repair them and send them back to you. So yes, definitely more and more people are looking to hang on to things and rediscover them, and it's no wonder that there are all these sort of like traditional forums and things like that popping up everywhere, because people are just going and finding all these rods in boot sales and restoring them and fishing with them, because they're still good fishing rods, regardless of it not being as light as the 2-ounce sort of toothpick that they have these days.
Yeah, and it's interesting. I was thinking about if we talked about, we use Sage as an example here, because if you ask people what's the classic Sage, it'll be the XP. And I don't know what one of those costs. Let's say it's $250, something like that. It's a greatly revered rod. I can see the values of those going up if they haven't already. But also there were rods around that just before and at the same time. And I've still got an RPL. This sounds really geeky. I'm sorry, everyone. An RPL Plus, but I preferred personally the RPL, which was the brand before, but at the same time as the XP was the SP. And I passed my advanced casting instructor's exam with one. People I see sometimes say it's too floppy or too deep. It's not. It's a super smooth. I think smooth performance is what SP stands for. And I could make big casts with it. I have a 9-foot 6-weight, fabulous rod. And it may be some of these. It's sort of kind of, to me, getting a bit like the classic car market, that people are now, not that I have any real inkling or understanding of it, but I'm seeing people going back to, the Peugeot 205 GTI. They're making good money now, because people are going back, looking back retrospectively, think, "God, that was good." And I can see this happening. And I think, if you see some of these rods knocking around that you can pick up. A friend of mine I think he bought a Thomas and Thomas. I think it was a Paradigm in a junk shop for like £2 or something silly like that, with £5.
Yeah.
I've cast it.
Yeah.
It's fantastic rod.
Yeah.
Absolutely fantastic
Yeah.
rod. And
Yeah.
so I wonder if this may be, instead of people search out these rods, and hopefully some of if you're not aware of these models or brands, they're pretty good ones, and worth having a look for to see if you can find these as a way in.
Yeah.
And they're still really good. They're still really good to cast and fun to fish with too, aren't they?
Yeah. Yeah, most definitely. But I will say that a lot of these classic rods, they're going for really good money now. Sort of like, I remember when I started to move over to bamboo, and I was sort of like jettisoning all of my Winstons, and there was a lot of them. I couldn't sell them for love of money, so I gave a lot of them away and sold them for like about £200. And I find now that 10 to a dozen years later, they're selling for like 3 times that, or £600 or £700 for an old Winston, WT or a B2T and things like that. And in fact, I had a pristine DL4, which is one of these. It wasn't around for a long time, but it was a specialist sort of Spring Creek model, and it was sort of like really, really soft for short casts to spooky fish and things like that. And it was almost unused, and I saw one eBay thing selling it for like $2,000 or $3,000. It was absolutely mad, and I actually gave it away virtually to someone for about £150. So like it was, but there you go. In amongst the bargains, there, if people have hung on to these things, they would probably make some good money out of it. So
yeah, that's another one I was thinking of, and I saw actually the chap who told me about the SPLCA he'd bought, because I have no idea what they're worth, but they're not going to be that sort of money, and I'm never going to sell it because I think it's such a funky rod. But he is selling a SLT Sage. I think it's an 8'9" 3-weight, something like that, and I found that hard not to buy. Just for old time's sake, I've got an 8.5-foot 4-weight that's broken tip, and it's been broken for 15 years. So I'm going to get that fixed. That's going to be one of my tasks, and to get that fishing, an 8.5-foot 4-weight, to go fish again. But it's kind of cool just talking about this stuff and reminiscing, and thinking, actually, they're still bloody good rods. Yet, and the new ones are, of course, bloody good rods as well. Don't get me wrong. But you can sort of kind of have a sniff through and think, oh, actually, that's really, that could fit in and that could fit in. And the reason I didn't buy the SLT is because of the Gatti. That's purely the reason. I thought, well, it's going to... So I'm trying to fill gaps rather than duplicate. That's what I've tried to do. I had, like you, a big clear out. And of course, when you've got it in your mind that you're going to sell something, you sell it. And sometimes you think, actually, I will hang on to it. But I guess that's going to be the difference, isn't it? Whereas, as you said, the David Norwich quote about the black forest of rods, I wonder if that will change now and people will search these out perhaps a little bit more. And as a result of that, as you've clearly said, with the Winston rods particularly as well, that the value of those is going to be dragged up by the retail value of the latest, newest rod as well, isn't it now? So that's going to be, so that's going to be kind of interesting to see. So you touched on, we're going to move on to bamboo shortly, because I know listeners are interested in that, and I would love some hints and tips as well about that. But glass you touched on, and you mentioned Sandy Nelson, friend of the show, who has been on and did a great podcast talking about those. Is glass sort of, as an aside, you mentioned, and you've touched on that you're fishing primarily bamboo rods now, a glass sort of a side sort of project that you think, oh, I'll fish one of those today rather than the bamboo rods? How does that fit into the rod quiver?
I think in general it would be bamboo, but for sort of like lower end, not lower end, but basically lower weights and shorter rods. I think for glass they handle it better. Whereas if you had a very short bamboo, you know, that sort of feature of glass to almost self-load without needing a lot of line out. I think that is it's one of its strengths, and obviously its strength of material. So in those situations, I think yes, it would, as you say, complement your artillery rather than sort of duplicating it. So I don't fish any short three weights, and I was speaking to Sandy quite recently, and he was trying to push a 6'6" three yomogi onto me, and I was very interested in that because I don't fish that sort of length with the bamboo. But in general, it would be bamboo, but on the outer edges where I'm not it's not being sort of already held by bamboo, I would definitely consider glass. So yeah.
Yeah, nice. And you said, when you decided that you've not fished graphite really for 10 years or so, and you cleared out the Winston locker. And why was it that you decided bamboo? What was it that made you think, actually, I'm going to turn my back on, I guess, what's considered modern materials, or is a modern material? What made you turn your back on it and say, actually, no, I'm going to go down the bamboo route now. This is why I
Yeah,
want to do this, and this is what I want to do.
yeah. I started doing it quite piecemeal, I guess, in the mid 2000s. I always wanted to go down bamboo, sort of having such a large collection of Winstons, and Winstons being very famous for their bamboo. That was always my goal. But the cost of them was huge even back then. If you wanted to buy a new Winston bamboo, was like $2,500 or something like that, which was huge compared to a $600 graphite. And so I started to look at sort of getting one, and I had a sort of few shaky starts. I had a went down with a couple of makers, which probably should remain unmentioned, and it didn't really go too well. I mean, they yeah they weren't very good examples. Even though that they were very well known globally, they weren't very good examples, and I almost gave up at that point. Said, "Oh my God, I've shelled out quite a lot of money. It's come back a load of garbage," and I almost gave up. But I actually found a UK maker by the name of Gary Marshall. I don't know if you've interviewed him, but he did have a good name. He's recently retired, and he made an absolutely beautiful rod for me. And I guess he restored my faith in bamboo. And I fished that rod, and another one that he made for me a year or so later. But it didn't, and I fished it on the chalk streams that I did fish, and it they were beautiful rods, and they felt really good to cast, but they didn't really have the performance. So where it didn't really have the performance that I needed for the particular situation, I still used my Winstons. And but it wasn't until really I started to uh, get rods made up by James Reed, who did produce, as well as really great casting and fishing rods and looking really great. They were very performant because they not only were hollowed, which giving them faster recovery, but they had spliced joints, so um, they didn't feel slow, and they recovered quickly, and you can still put out 70 foot of line if you wanted to, and things like that, and cast heavily weighted rigs and or throw intruders with them, and so you weren't really hampered by things which you would have been if you were fishing classic bamboo rods, I think. So yeah, and that gave me the confidence to just move wholesale into bamboo, really. So yeah.
And so you said you made some mistakes. Did you have most of the rods made for you, or did you buy some second hand? And if you did, any tips for people for what to look out for and where to look for those sorts of things? Did you do that, or you tended to have them built for you?
In fact, I've had them all built for me, from James, Gary, and those two makers who shall remain nameless. And in general, I think it has to be really a leap of faith, unless you're quite lucky to be able to go to one of these bamboo meets and you can try all these different models and things. And I think that's the key, really. I mean, they don't really have them here in the UK, but I think in the US they have these huge like bamboo meets, and people go along and try out all these rods and say, oh yeah, that one really suits my style, and then they would contact the maker and have one made up. But in general, I mean, I did that with Gary, definitely Gary Marshall, when I contacted him, and I actually went up, and he had a whole range of different from classic models right up to new ones that he had made up on from classic tapers. And it's interesting because I always thought my preference was for parabolic rods, but when I went up to see Gary, he knew, but I realized that what I thought was a parabolic rod wasn't actually a parabolic rod. It was actually a semi-parabolic. It flexed in a different place to what I thought. And I went up there with the intention of getting a Paul Young rod made up by Gary, but after casting all of these rods, I settled on something completely different. It was a Garrison taper, and I think that's it. You really need to get out there and try some rods, and find what's best for you. Otherwise, you could end up getting a rod, or obviously, if it's in a second-hand rod, then you can sell it off or whatever. But if you've gone down the path and waited 2 years for somebody to make a rod, and you say, oh bloody hell, this thing, I don't like it at all, I'll have to get rid of it and lose a couple of £100 on getting rid of it. So I think that's the main thing: getting out there and testing as many as you can, unless of course you can't do, which really you have to rely on faith, or on recommendations of others on forums and things like that. So yeah,
That's some good advice. And I think bamboo particularly may be one of those things that people like the idea of, and then, like you say, they cast it and think, actually, this may not be. And the opportunity to cast some, and I'm sure, like you say, with Gary, I know with Luke and other people as well, that you can go cast them. And I did a podcast where he talked about a new taper, and I ended up buying one of the rods. And then I said to him, oh, actually, can you make it a 3-piecer so I can travel with it? And then instead of it being 8 foot, can you make it 7'9"? And it's a fabulous rod. I'm absolutely thrilled with it. It's a 4-weight, so I think I can do most things with it. And I always take it that I cast the 8-footer, so I had a good understanding of the action, tried some lines on it. Those things are so important. And even with graphite rods, I'll get on my soapbox a little bit. Cast one. Don't ask somebody if they like it, because what I might like and what you might like and what somebody else can be completely different things. So particularly if you're spending a lot of hard-earned on a bamboo rod, for example, if you've got the opportunity. I know Luke and I have talked years back, and I'm still thinking about it, as some sort of conclave for bamboo where builders can get together, perhaps with some glass as well, and talk and chat with these things. And again, if you're bamboo curious, have a look at Colorado cane. That's a great video on YouTube that gives you a sense of rod building, and it's a little bit older now, but it's just great. And one of the things I wanted to ask you actually while we're talking about bamboo, because you're investing money in some, let's be honest about this. One of the things I don't mind about that is that I don't think that the value of them goes down. So I feel I can console myself with that fact a little bit. But I saw I think it was on a Facebook group or something like that, there was a Leonard come up, and they are big money rods, and this thing had never been fished. And while I've been talking about that Colorado cane, I think it is, Mike Clark says, they've spent a lot of hours building these things. They want you to fish them. Don't put them behind glass. Fish the bloody things and enjoy them. And they're so usable, aren't they? They're robust. They're so usable and they're enjoyable. There's just something to me, and I know it's only my view, and I know you probably share it, that's very pleasing about it. They don't have, I don't think, a lot of limitations. Sometimes if I'm putting slack, it may not be in quite the same way. There may not be, 100% as accurate. They're pretty damn close as some of these very, very modern rods. But they're so usable, aren't they? And they're so pleasing to use, and I really, really enjoy it. And I get the sense you're very similar along those lines too, aren't you? And you use them, don't you? Got to use these bloody things, haven't you?
Most definitely. I mean, all of the bamboo and the classic reels that go along with them, they're all bought to fish. There's not one of the rods that I've commissioned from James or any of the other makers which I haven't used. I haven't used in anger. And the reels. I will admit to having a real fetish as well. And although I had a large collection of these Able CNC reels, the bench reels are very expensive, and some of them have taken, like for a reel I've waited 6 years for William Olson to deliver. It's a huge reel in Canada and the US, and many people think, I actually couldn't take that on the river in case I dinged it, and then I'll lose value. But the thing is, these, as you say, these makers make their rods and reels to be used, and it's actually a crime, I think, to just put something like that away just because you think you'll get X $1,000 in the future, and you've just wasted, probably, years waiting for it to come, and then another umpteen years sitting in a closet. So I think it's crazy, and although there are collectors around who buy these, especially as not investment, but actually to make money, to turn it over in some point in the future. But who's to say you'll ever get there? You may not even get there. You may pop your clogs, and then all the years have been wasted anyway. But enjoy these things while you still can, I think, and definitely, the reels. I've got very expensive reels by Olson and Maurice Knoll, who makes titanium reels, which have got dings on them because I've used them, and that's how they should be, really. So yeah.
Yeah, they call it, I believe, in the antique trade, patina. And I think I'd be more likely to buy something with a bit of character to it. And I had a rod, I've still got it, and I won't get rid of it because I dropped it on the big hole in Montana, and there's a scratch on it because I'd caught a grayling. I wanted to catch a grayling, a fluvial grayling in Montana on a river, and did. And I was so excited, I threw my rod down, and it's got a scratch on it where I caught that fish. And I love that, and I won't be getting rid of that rod. And I love it because of that scratch. And those little things do mean something to me. And I think I'm probably the opposite to you in the sense that the reels, I don't feel I want to invest money in, not because I don't like them, because they're beautiful, some of those reels, I have to say, but I kind of like the mix of a modern reel and an older style rod for bamboo. And I kind of like,
That's interesting. Very
a
interesting.
loop reel on a bamboo rod, or the new Sage Spey range of reels. They do a trout one as well,
Yeah,
which looks, it's like a Hardy, I guess, in some respects, but with a wonderful drag and everything else. And I kind of like that mix between what would be considered the old and the new.
yeah,
So I kind of like
yeah,
that. But I do have a Mark II, so very, very cheap, I hasten to add, comparable to the Mark One, a Hardy Cascapedia.
yeah,
And that looks kind of cool too. But I'm using the modern reels on there, so I kind of like that mix. And then that might mean I
yeah,
can get
yeah,
another rod instead of a reel and
yeah.
stuff like that. But that's part of the fun of it, isn't it? Finding. Do you go down the silk line route? I should ask.
Silk line. I actually was an old silk person when I first started fishing a bamboo. I guess I went very, traditional and started fishing silk. And I had a lot of very expensive top end silks like Phoenix and Terenzia and um, the Japanese maker Yano. And they're fantastic to fish on the chalk streams with a dry fly, but they if you're going to throw a bit of weight or something like that, they can't turn over the weight. So obviously, if you're a dry fly man, they're probably perfect. But I also started to really get tired of stripping down the reel and drying it on the dryer and muciling it every time, and or getting out on the river at or getting to like 5 p.m. when all the hatch is coming off, and then your bloody line starts to sink. So, oh crap, I've got to go and find another reel with another silk line or something like that. So that aspect really started to tick me off, and I went back to plastic lines, especially after starting to fish James's rods, which are really, you know, you could toss anything for them, big, heavy flies and things like that. They're BC rods, they're meant to throw junk and stuff like that. So they can handle it. They're not some dainty sort of like rod, for casting 22 dries or something like that. They can really toss some heavy stuff, even four weights. So in general, I stopped fishing silks, but I'm getting silk curious again. So you never know. So yeah.
Yeah, my life's too short. I'm not going to do that. I think I've got a Phoenix up, so I've never even used it. It's still in its box, and that's a
Yeah.
crime, really. But I just can't be bothered. I want to go fishing.
Yeah.
I'm the worst of it. If I'm on the river, I want to go fishing. And although I'm incredibly patient, I'm not patient enough to go and get the red mucilin out and treat the line and everything else. So anyone who does that has my utmost respect. But I can't. And it was interesting that you said about, chucking some heavy stuff with double handers, but with single handers as well with bamboo, I can chuck a nymph and it's not an issue to do that as well. So, it isn't just a high days and holidays type thing. And I was thinking about that one weight SPLCA as a graphite rod. That's not high. I used to fish it almost exclusively, and I had some okay size fish for Devon down here on it, and it's absolutely fine. If you can know how to cope with wind or conditions, then it's fine. It doesn't worry me too much from that point of view. And similarly with bamboo as well, that I find it incredibly easy to work with as well from that point of view. So double handers, you talked about James's rod. One thing before we go on to this, I'm sure there's listeners. I've read Ritz's book, but you've mentioned the term parabolic twice. Would you explain, and semi-parabolic, would you explain to listeners what that actually means as term? Because we've talked about graphite rod actions, and I know Bruce and Walker, I think, tend to make parabolic graphite rods. If
No, I don't
I'm
think that. I don't
no,
think
they
they do.
don't. No, I'm
No, no, they have.
apologies.
I mean, they have most of them were actually quite progressive. So
Right.
you know, but they did have. In fact, I have one of them, a power light, which is, they call a classic spay, but that's more of a semi-parabolic. So sort of explaining that, like a semi-parabolic would be a sort of like a smooth curve from the butt through to the tip. So it would flex roughly in the middle of the rod, whereas a full parabolic, it has a stronger tip, so it's, more material in the tip, so so it flexes right near your hand, basically, so right down into the butt area. And I guess there are not many rods these days, but curiously, the maker, um, Bob Miser, he makes parabolic slash semi-parabolic rod called the MKS or the MKX, is a newer version, and they're very popular with steelhead fishermen and Atlantic fishermen on that side of the pond. And although it wouldn't be considered a new taper, they have um, some advantages, in terms of like feel, I guess, and also slinging longer heads and things like that. Whereas, the shorter, uh, the sort of tippier ones would mainly be used for sort of like the Scandi type actions, where you just sort of like tapping out a line, like a shooting head, but with the semi and full parabolics, they can cast a long headed line easier, I believe. So yeah.
Nice, nice. And tell me, the double hander, has it been christened on steelhead or salmon? Have it, and what was it like that moment when it first happened?
Well, definitely steelhead. I mean, in fact, on that trip in Bulkley, um, I had James and Mark Schamberg actually deliver my rod to me at Frontier Far West, and I christened that rod with a beautiful chrome steely, and it was absolutely amazing. Sort of like it was one of these rods, which it was called a classic spay, so it wasn't it was um, designed to be able to cast a longer head. In general, these new bamboos are suited to sort of like casting shooting heads, because they're, sort of like lifting these long heads out there. It's just not really a nice thing to do. But so they cast um, sort of shooting heads in the range of 30 to 35 or 40 feet heads. But this classic one can cast like a medium head taper quite nicely. So it's a 54 head for 50-foot head or something like that. It would cast it quite nicely. But yes, I was casting a Scandi head on the Barclay, and it took a Winter's Hope and shot off. Doing about 10 jumps while stripping line at an amazing rate. Mark Schamberg's reel called Saint Mark, his first model, was just spinning away, sort of like whining while this thing shot off, back to the sea. So it was an amazing experience. So yeah.
Yeah, that sounds really, really cool. And I've talked on here that I've been fishing a glass salmon rod. I'll explain if I'm lucky enough to catch salmon on it. I will explain the reason while I'm doing it or why I've been doing it. And it's a special one to me and it means a lot to me. And I'm not going to say until I've done it if I'm lucky enough to do it. But I've had trout on the side, 2.5 pound trout on the salmon rod, the glass salmon rod, and absolutely phenomenal. You feel everything. So my fingers are tightly crossed that perhaps some magic may happen. So I keep trying. I've been trying hard, but the temperature's coming up. This is being recorded on the 12th, and the temperature's coming up. So it may be I go back into trout mode, that the rivers have dropped back a little bit. So I may go back into trout mode a little bit more closely at the moment. But that's the nice thing about it. But, we've talked about tackle, and the stuff that we've talked about generally, like I said before, has been more towards the upper end. But is that fueled by a passion for what you're doing and a love for it and wanting to have the pride of ownership? It's because I get the sense that you love fishing, you love the aesthetics of every aspect of it. And does the tackle come over to that? So you'd rather, instead of buy a rod that lasts 2 or 3 seasons, you're buying something, or a rod or a reel, that will last you a long period of time. So over that time frame, it probably nets out pretty similar somewhere down the line. Is that what part of it's driven by, that it's just a passion for our pastime and the aesthetics of it, including the tackle?
I think yes. I mean, it all sort of comes together. Yes, definitely. I'm obsessed and have been all my life with fishing. I've been as obsessed with tackle. I love the way tackle looks and feels. So, I, I don't think of it as an investment in terms of, like, I'm paying a lot for something, uh, and it's going to cost me X pounds over the next 20 years. So therefore, it's worth it. It's definitely something which I really like the look of, and how it feels, and how it feels to fish. And also, I guess, especially in the last 10 years, where I've gone into sort of very custom made tackle, like reels and rods, that I have a connection with the maker. So the reels and rods that I've had, most use of over the last dozen years, have been James Reed, and Mark Schamberg, and I feel I've got a connection with these guys, and the fact that not only are they fantastic guys and great makers, but they're really good fishermen themselves. They're guides and steely bums. So I have a lot of respect for the tackle that they make. And maybe there are some makers who make beautiful pieces of tackle, but may not be great fishermen. So in that respect, I wouldn't value their stuff as much as I would from James and Mark, because you know, they've made their tackle, and they use their tackle and catch a lot of fish with them. So it's you know it's just it just gives more credence to the stuff that they put out and that I'm using. That's all. So yeah.
That's nice. That's support, isn't it? And I wonder if we will. Do you think we'll see? And I used the term initially when I first interviewed Luke on here, of artisan, and he said, "Well, I'm not really an artisan." And then we sort of came round, and perhaps he was. Do you see more of this, rod builders, reel makers, continuing to spring up? As it feels to me, certainly, as though demand for slightly more esoteric tackle is growing, that there may be more people springing up as a result of that. Do you see that happening, or do you see it condensing? How do you see that sort of marketplace as an aside for the more mainstream?
I think that's exactly what I think, because what's happening, I think, is that you're getting this sort of like cheap end of the market, which is being mass produced by, offshore, and they're getting really good. So Korea and China are putting out stuff which can do the job and do it really well for very little money. So previously, the top sort of CNC guys, or factory guys in the middle, they're being pressured a lot, because you can, as we spoke about earlier, these Max Catch can put out a rod which costs like 50 quid, and do probably 90% of what a sage could for £1,000. Maybe not 90%, but 70 or 80%. So makers really need to separate themselves from that, and I think they can only do that by becoming more custom, more artisan, more bespoke, and if you've got like a reel maker who spends, if you have to wait three to 6 years for a reel, they're gonna have like a lot of people waiting in line for one of these things because they don't want the garbage on the other end of the spectrum, even though it, so I think the people in the middle are going to be really pressured because the low end stuff can really do it now.
Yeah. Yeah, it'll be an interesting one to see how it plays out. And it'll be, I hope if we look at bamboo, because we've sort of kind of ended on that, there are more people coming through who are building bamboo rods or being taught how to build bamboo rods. That would be seriously cool if that continues. And, I sense, I'm not at the cutting edge, but I sense that there is this sort of move to look at other materials to fish with or different products to own. So that's kind of cool. There's enough space for everyone, I think. So, I'm fascinated to see how this all plays out. But it's been really cool just chewing the fat really about, and I'm sure many people are having this conversation with friends right now. And that's why I thought it would be really interesting, as I know you as a fine fisherman first and foremost, but also a connoisseur of tackle and understanding it and looking at a particular end of that marketplace. And I wanted to understand why you're looking at that. And now I have a clear understanding of that. But also, for many anglers as well listening that may not want to buy a bamboo rod, but hopefully we talked about stuff that perhaps you can search out and think, well, actually, some of the things we've mentioned might be worth a look and worth a try. The advice I always try and give, and is always given from these podcasts, is try one if you can. That's the best thing you can do. Take your fly line along. If you've got more than one, even better. But if a buddy's got one that you can try, and that will make life so much easier and in the long run for you, and make that process a whole lot easier. But it's been great speaking with you today, Steve. I've really enjoyed it. Tell me, if there is one place that you would like to cast one of your beautiful rods and hear it sing on the river, or a lake or on the sea, where is the one place that you so far haven't visited that you would love to go visit and go fish?
And I think it would have to be for steelhead, and I haven't fished it, but I've always wanted to, and it'd be the shoots. So I want to get back to the PN Pacific Northwest and fish the shoots for my with my bamboo rods. Most probably my James Reed steelhead is favorite with a Mark Schamberg reel, and I think that would be the icing on the cake. So yeah.
Nice. I can heartily recommend the Deschutes. It's a wonderful
Fantastic.
river, and I've been lucky to catch a steelhead there. I lost one as well, actually. I only had 2 or 3 days there. I've been travelling around and did some other places as well. But Deschutes is a picturesque place to fish as well. It's termed desert, I believe, as well, and it's an extraordinary place. So I can heartily recommend it, and I think that's a very fine choice. Steve Lum, it's been fantastic talking with you today. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk with me on the Fly Culture podcast today.
Pete, a pleasure.
Everyone, this has been another edition of the Fly Culture podcast. Thank you so much for listening. And as ever, there'll be plenty more coming this way very, very soon. Thanks for listening.
The Fly Culture podcast is brought to you in association with Fly Culture, a quarterly print magazine. For more information, please visit flyculturemag.com. You can also find Fly Culture on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter.